Some institutions fall in a single night. A scandal breaks. A headline drops. And by morning, the entire edifice has crumbled into dust. But the British monarchy doesn't work like that. It never has. What is happening right now, inside the walls of Buckingham Palace, inside the legal corridors surrounding it, and inside a cold farmhouse in Norfolk, is not a collapse. It is something slower. Something, in many ways, far more painful. It is an institution bleeding out. And the man at the center of it all, King Charles III, is being forced to remain upright, composed, and fully functional while the wound drains him of the one thing a constitutional monarchy absolutely cannot survive without: credibility. But here is what makes this story different from every royal scandal that came before it. The person inflicting this wound is not a political rival. It is not a hostile press. It is not even a restless Republican public tired of funding a family they no longer believe in. It is his brother, a man with whom he shares not just blood and history, but 66 years of a relationship that began in childhood. And the requirements of the crown are now systematically forcing him to sever it. Let me take you back to the 19th of February, 2026. It should have been an ordinary day. The kind of quiet birthday that men in their mid-60s tend to have. A small gathering, perhaps. A private dinner. A few phone calls from family. Instead, Prince Andrew, His Royal Highness, the Duke of York, second son of Queen Elizabeth II, was arrested. Not escorted discreetly from a function. Not quietly invited for an informal chat with investigators. Arrested. On suspicion of misconduct in public office. And with that, something shifted permanently. Because the moment those police vehicles pulled up, the moment Andrew found himself inside a custody suite under cold fluorescent lighting, in a holding room where titles do not travel, 6 decades of institutional protection evaporated in a single morning. Think carefully about what that means. This is a man who has spent his entire life insulated by the monarchy, protected by its prestige, elevated by its rituals, cushioned by its wealth, and shielded by the quiet understanding that certain doors simply did not open for people like him. Not in that direction. And in the space of a few hours, he was just a man in a room, answering questions, like anyone else. That shift, from palace corridors to interrogation rooms, is not merely a change of venue. It is the visible public collapse of an identity that had been carefully constructed and sustained for over 60 years. And the thing being investigated? This is where the story stops being about one man and starts being about something much larger. Parliamentary authorization was granted to release confidential files from Andrew's time as Britain's special representative for international trade and investment. That is the procedural step that moved this situation from the realm of family scandal into the domain of statecraft and potential criminal liability. The question investigators are now asking is stark and devastating. Did Prince Andrew use his government position, the access, the credibility, the protected information that came with that role, to share sensitive economic material with people in the orbit of Jeffrey Epstein? Not just poor associations. Not just embarrassing photographs taken at a convicted predator's parties. The question is whether the machinery of the British state was actively used in service of one of the most notorious criminals of the modern era. The monarchy has survived scandal before. Let's be honest about that. Infidelity. Divorce. Explosive tell-all interviews broadcast to tens of millions of people. A princess who openly discussed the disintegration of her marriage on national television. A prince who spent years feuding with the institution from a mansion in California, giving interviews that dismantled decades of carefully managed public image. The institution has mechanisms for managing disgrace. It distances itself. It strips titles. It issues carefully worded statements that say everything and commit to nothing. It waits for the news cycle to exhaust itself and move on. And eventually it does. But what is happening now is categorically different. And the reason it is different comes down to a single distinction that changes everything. Personal scandal can be absorbed. Personal scandal is about human weakness. And the public, however disappointed, however cynical, understands human weakness on some level. It judges, it gossips, it shakes its head. But it moves on. What cannot be absorbed? What has no established precedent in the modern history of the British monarchy is the possibility that a royal used a government position to pass protected state information to a convicted sex offender. That is not a scandal in the conventional sense of the word. That is a betrayal of the state, a betrayal of the diplomatic partners who trusted that information would remain within appropriate channels, a betrayal of the constitutional arrangement that grants royal family members the kind of access and credibility that ordinary citizens and even most politicians never receive. And betrayals of that magnitude do not just damage reputations. They raise fundamental questions about whether royal privilege is compatible with national security, about whether the arrangement that gives princes access to the corridors of government is an asset to the nation or, in the wrong hands, a liability of the most serious kind. If the evidence supports the allegations, and it is important to stress that this is still conditional, still dependent on what the documents actually show, then we are not talking about a family managing an embarrassing relative. We are talking about a former senior royal standing trial, being tried in a British court, for the use of his office to facilitate connections with Jeffrey Epstein, and a criminal proceeding of that nature, conducted in public, covered by the world's press, examined by constitutional lawyers and historians and commentators across every platform and in every language, would produce a moment in the history of the British monarchy that would take generations to absorb. That would fundamentally alter the terms on which the institution is understood, not just in Britain, everywhere. So how has Andrew responded to all of this? Not with cooperation, not with contrition, not with the quiet, dignified acknowledgement that the situation is serious and that the proper response is to engage with it honestly. He has responded with a threat. His legal team has announced that if Andrew is compelled to testify, he will seek a judicial review. Now, the framing of that threat matters enormously, because it is easy to hear the words judicial review and think of it as a routine legal maneuver, the kind of procedural step that any defendant's lawyers might consider. It is not that. This is not a procedural objection to the manner in which the investigation is being conducted. It is not a technical legal argument about the precise scope of the inquiry or the admissibility of particular evidence. It is a direct challenge to the authority of the state to compel his participation in its own investigation. In plain language, Andrew is threatening to sue the Crown, the institution that housed him, that funded him, that protected him and provided for him and given him access and privilege and relevance for his entire life. The machinery of government that operates on behalf of the monarch, who is his own brother. He has placed himself on one side of a line and the investigation on the other. And he is saying, in effect, that his personal survival takes priority over the transparency and accountability that the institution he was born into is fighting to demonstrate it upholds. He is saying that he is prepared to deploy every legal mechanism available to him to prevent the law from applying to him in the way it would apply to any other person accused of similar conduct. For those watching this unfold inside the palace, inside Parliament, inside the cabinet offices of government, the word being used is not complicated. It is not nuanced. It is not a matter of differing institutional perspectives. The word is alarm, because Andrew is not simply mounting a legal defense. He is using the residual power of his royal history, the access to legal resources, the media attention, the institutional weight of a name that still commands front pages, to obstruct a process that the state itself is trying to conduct. Against the state, against the institution, against his own brother's government. And the central calculation he is making is a deliberate one. He is betting that the monarchy will eventually conclude that the reputational cost of a very public criminal trial of a former senior royal, played out over months in a British courtroom with the world's cameras pointed at it, outweighs the reputational cost of a negotiated settlement. A closed file. An investigation that is quietly, carefully brought to an end without the full weight of the documentary evidence ever being placed in the public record. He is betting on the institution's instinct for self-preservation overcoming its stated commitment to principle. And here is the uncomfortable question at the heart of all of it. Is he right? The monarchy says no one is above the law. It says this publicly and with apparent conviction. It places this principle at the center of its public communications. It repeats it in speeches and statements and official responses to difficult questions. But Andrew's legal strategy is, at its core, a test of whether the monarchy actually means that. Whether, when the cost of meaning it becomes sufficiently high, when the person involved is not a distant associate but a member of the family, the principles bend in the way they always have, in the way he has always expected them to. That is the test he is forcing the institution to take. And then there is the matter of Sarah Ferguson. In the immediate aftermath of Andrew's arrest, his former wife, whose name had appeared in the Epstein files and who was therefore herself subject to considerable scrutiny, left Britain. Not in a panic. Not in the chaotic, unplanned way that a person flees when they are frightened and acting on instinct. Reports indicate that her departure was managed, that she was moved from her residence under cover of darkness, that the vehicle was arranged with Andrew's involvement, that the entire operation was designed specifically to ensure she reached it unobserved by the press, which was already gathering outside. She surfaced in the Austrian Alps. Now, it is important to be careful here, because the precise mechanics of that departure remain matters for investigators, and the full picture has not been established publicly. The degree of Andrew's direct organizational involvement, the specific decisions that were made and by whom, these details have not been confirmed in their entirety. But what can be said is this. A managed departure is something categorically different from an evacuation driven by fear. It is different in what it suggests about the state of mind of the people involved, about the degree of advanced planning, and about the purpose it was intended to serve. A managed departure is a strategic repositioning, a deliberate creation of geographic and legal distance between a person whose name appears in sensitive files and the scrutiny that those files have generated, and for an institution that is simultaneously, in its official communications and its public posture, projecting a commitment to transparency and cooperation with the investigation. The meaning of that departure is not difficult to read. The monarchy is saying publicly that it supports accountability and that no one is exempt from the processes of law. And one of its former members is, in that same moment, apparently assisting another former member to leave the country. The message that sends is not one of accountability. It is evasion, not cooperation with the investigation, but the active management of distance from it. And for Charles and William, who are managing this situation with the awareness that every action taken by anyone connected to the institution becomes part of the story the institution tells about itself, that departure is not a private matter. It is evidence. Evidence of the gap between what the institution says and what those associated with it actually do when the pressure reaches a certain level. There is a version of this story that focuses entirely on the constitutional and political dimensions, on the legal proceedings, the parliamentary maneuvers, the institutional mechanisms being deployed. But to understand the full weight of what is happening, you have to understand what this means for Charles personally. Because he is not simply a king managing a political crisis. He is a brother watching a sibling use the structures of the state to obstruct a process that the integrity of the state requires. He is a monarch who has spent his entire reign, from the moment it began, trying to establish that the institution he leads operates with genuine accountability, that it is committed, in substance and not just in language, to the principle that no one regardless of birth or title is above the law. And he is watching the person who should have been helping him carry that burden, the only person in the world who shares his particular familial perspective on the institution and its weight, use every resource available to him to ensure that the law bends in the way it always has. Those who watch Charles closely do not describe his demeanor through this crisis as stoic. The word they reach for is something closer to quiet devastation, because the wound is not abstract. It is not institutional in nature alone. It is personal in ways that cut through the formal distance that royalty is supposed to maintain between the human being and the role. Charles values family. He values continuity and harmony. He values the bonds formed across a lifetime shared. And he is now being required, by the institution he leads and by the obligations of the crown he wears, to preside over the forced severance of something that cannot be resumed. There is grief in this. Genuine grief. Not political calculation dressed up as human emotion, but the actual experience of losing something irreplaceable, of watching a relationship that began in childhood become first a liability and then an impossibility. He is presiding over the forced dismantling of a personal bond to save an institutional one, and the two cannot both survive. The Succession and Accountability Act, which has reportedly been moving from corridor conversations to parliamentary consideration, represents the institutional response to the question that Andrew's situation has made impossible to defer any longer. If royal titles are no longer sanctuaries where ordinary law stops at the palace gates, then the rules governing who can shelter behind those gates, and under what conditions, need to be rewritten to reflect that reality. The era of the untouchable royal, protected from consequence by the ancient prestige of a bloodline rather than by the substance of what they contribute, is being brought to a close. and it is being brought to a close by precisely the kind of case that makes its closure most urgent. William is watching all of this with the particular, focused alarm of someone who understands that his children will inherit whatever remains of this institution after the current crisis has run its course. For William, the stakes are not simply the damage being done in the present. They are the future viability of the crown itself. The world that George and Charlotte and Louis will one day be asked to lead. When he looks at his uncle's legal strategy, the threats of judicial review, the scorched earth posture, the willingness to deploy legal mechanisms against the government his own father leads, he does not see a family dispute or even a constitutional complication. He sees a wrecking ball being aimed at the foundations of an institution that his children will one day be responsible for holding together. He sees the accumulated reputational capital that generations of the royal family built, carefully and at considerable personal cost, being depleted by the defensive maneuvers of a single person who has concluded that his own survival outweighs the survival of the institution that gave him everything he ever had. William has been describing his vision for the monarchy through his public actions and his private interventions for years now. A leaner institution, a more accountable one, a crown that earns its place in the modern democratic order through genuine contribution rather than inherited prestige. And everything that Andrew's situation is producing is making that vision both more urgent and more clearly necessary. The York branch is being removed from the official narrative. That removal carries real costs. Beatrice and Eugenie did not choose their circumstances. They have conducted themselves with genuine dignity through enormous inherited difficulty. The costs they are bearing are, in several important respects, unfair. But the institutional logic is clear, and it is cold. The crown cannot carry this weight indefinitely and continue to project the credibility it requires to survive as a meaningful institution in a modern democracy. Something has to give. And what is giving is not the institution's commitment to accountability. It is the relationship between the institution and the people whose conduct makes that commitment impossible to maintain. The historical comparison being reached for by those trying to understand this crisis within the longer arc of royal history is the Duke of Windsor. Edward VIII, the king who abdicated in 1936 to marry Wallis Simpson and spent the remainder of his long life in a kind of gilded exile, moving between borrowed houses and European resorts, attending dinners that became gradually less prestigious, receiving visitors who were gradually less powerful, fading slowly from relevance while the institution he had abandoned consolidated itself around his absence and eventually thrived without him. The comparison is imperfect. It has to be said clearly that the circumstances are different, the nature of the crisis is different, and the legal framework is entirely different. Edward's abdication was about personal desire and constitutional duty. Andrew's situation involves potential criminal conduct of a different order entirely. But the structural echo is unmistakable. A royal who could not be accommodated within the institution. A family forced to accept permanent distance from a member who had made himself incompatible with the requirements of the crown. An exile that was not freely chosen, but effectively imposed by the logic of what had happened and the impossibility of what could not be undone, and the slow, diminished life of reduced grandeur that followed. Andrew's version of that life is already underway. It is happening in real time in Norfolk, at Marsh Farm, surrounded by security fencing and agricultural silence, and the particular stillness of a man whose telephone is no longer ringing the way it once did, whose invitations have stopped arriving, whose relevance to the institution he was born into has been systematically reduced, step by step, decision by decision, to zero. But the specific danger of his situation, the thing that makes it more acute than a quiet family estrangement managed over time into a private existence, is the legal dimension. Edward Windsor's exile was personal and social. Andrew's threatens to become criminal. The honest answer is that nobody knows. And that uncertainty is itself part of the damage. The judicial review threat is designed to create a stalemate, a legal standoff that neither side can quickly win, and that therefore preserves the current ambiguity for as long as the legal process can be made to run. Every week that passes without resolution is a week the institution spends managing a wound rather than closing it. Andrew is alone in Norfolk, standing in a farmhouse surrounded by security cameras and legal strategies and the accumulated weight of his own choices, watching the institution that gave him everything he had moved forward without him. Charles is in London managing an institution that his own brother is using as a shield. carrying grief that is genuine and personal, presiding over the severance of something he did not choose and would not have chosen if any other choice had been available. William is watching and taking notes, learning, in the most direct and unsparing way possible, the cost of failing to act decisively earlier, of managing rather than resolving, of absorbing rather than confronting, of hoping that a wound will close on its own when what it actually required was surgery. And the institution continues forward under the weight of a burden that grows heavier with every day that passes without resolution, carrying the cost of decisions made decades ago by a man who believed that the protections of his birth would shield him from consequence, and discovering now, in the cold light of legal scrutiny and public judgment, that those protections have limits, that when those limits are reached, the law does not check bloodlines before it knocks on the door, and that even princes, in the end, stand alone.